Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Therese DeRoe, ERI's Assistant Director for Policy and Implementation, and I'm pleased to welcome you to ERI's final webinar of 2025, where we'll be discussing the environmental impacts of AI technology. Artificial intelligence has dominated the news the last couple of years, as has the ongoing development of large data centers across the United States and in Indiana. These data centers require considerable amounts of land, electricity, and water to operate. Communities across the state have been grappling with the pros and cons of hosting such facilities. Our staff here at ERI have also been closely following this issue along with faculty across the university. And we recently at ERI put together a new fact sheet on data centers that summarizes the community impacts and the legal requirements of these facilities, as well as pathways to reduce their environmental footprints. We'll share this fact sheet in the chat, as well as send it in a follow-up message to all webinar registrants. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to encourage everyone to register for the 2026 Indiana Sustainability and Resilience Conference that's happening in Bloomington on Friday, February 6th. This conference brings together sustainability-minded Hoosiers from across the state to discuss progress on Indiana's climate resilience and strategies to accelerate climate action. And yes, there has been progress, so we're excited to meet to discuss. We're very excited to be hosting Gina McCarthy, who is the first ever White House National Climate Advisor and the former administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, who will be the keynote speaker at our conference this year. ISRC is right around the corner, and emails get lost during the holiday season, so don't hesitate to reserve your spot by clicking on the link in the chat and registering. Now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. Gabe Filippelli is the Chancellor's Professor of Earth Sciences and our Executive Director here at the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute. Filippelli is a biogeochemist with broad training in climate change, exposure science, and environmental health. We're also excited to welcome Scott Shackelford, who's the Associate Vice President and Vice Chancellor for Research at IU Bloomington and the Executive Director of the Ostrom Workshop. A professor of business law and ethics at the Kelley School of Business, his research interests span cybersecurity and privacy, international law, property, and sustainability. And then joining us a little bit later is going to be Professor Jess Steinberg. She's an associate professor with the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. Her research concerns the political economy of development with a focus on violent conflict, natural resources, and regions of limited state presence. Her 2019 book, Mines, Communities and States, The Local Politics of Natural Resource Extraction in Africa, investigates the role of international mining firms, states, and local communities in natural resource extraction with the aim of understanding different governance outcomes. If you have questions for our speakers, please enter them in the Q&A feature at the bottom toolbar of your Zoom window. We'll try to answer as many as we can during the hour, and I'll facilitate a Q&A after our speakers have presented or potentially in between speakers if there are particularly relevant questions. So as the questions pop into your head for any of the speakers, go ahead and pop them in the Q&A as you think of them. So with that introduction, I'm excited to turn it over to our speakers, and we'll be starting with Gabe.
Good afternoon, everybody. If you can advance the slide, thank you. So my title of my little section is Hungry, Hungry Hippos. If you had to read this 5 million times to your kids, you would understand what I mean. Or will AI ruin our planet and our bank accounts? The short story to the latter is not necessarily if we're careful. So let's talk about, we'll cover a lot of these topics as we go forward, but this is certainly relevant to just a normal person. And here's an example of the estimations of how much more electricity costs because of data center costs in certain states, including in Indiana. I'll bring a stat a little bit later on. Have next slide, please. So overall, what do you need to know about AI in Indiana? Hopefully, most of your questions will be answered by the end of this 45 minutes of presentations. If not, there's some time for questions afterwards, of course. We've been having data centers for a very long time. Yeah, basic Google searches use them, but AI is certainly supercharging them, and that's because AI runs on different kinds of chips, like video graphic chips. They also have a ton of them. And so because of that, and these chips get very hot, and they need a significant amount of electricity and cooling to function at high performance. So this has become a big issue, and this is the issue that we're trying to grapple with and trying to answer, find solutions for as we move forward. So Scott is going to, after this, he's going to talk about what his expertise is in cybersecurity issues. Jess is going to join a little bit later. She's going to expand on some of the environmental impacts as well as talk about resource extraction. So hopefully by the end of this next 10 minutes, we'll have a little bit more understanding of how much electricity demand there is from these centers, how much water demand, and in our fact sheet, we include a couple external impacts, farmland loss, noise pollution, for example. Those are two topics I'm not going to cover here. Come next slide, please. So one way to conceive of how much electricity AI costs is just an examination of their chatbot usage in joules, which is the energy way we measure energy. But you can also translate that into microwave seconds or minutes. And because AI, most of them are open source, you can do this analysis pretty well in yourself. So a lot of labs have done this, including the MIT Technology Review Lab, and a lot of these graphics are from them. Actually, this nice older woman is not from them. I just grabbed something from PowerPoint. So a normal, so these AIs, the ones that we use mostly are large language models, and so they explore billions sometimes of parameters to come up with an answer that makes sense compared to everything else that's been generated before it. Hopefully, Scott can elaborate on that a little bit more. I'm not quite sure, but regardless, normal query like this might take about eight microwave seconds of energy. Next slide, please. Surprisingly, video layout, so when you ask AI to draw a picture, it actually takes a little bit less, or not significantly more, largely because it's not having to scan through all of the language, but instead it's scanning through a more simplified set of possibilities. Next slide, please. But if you ask it to write a college term paper, and as a professor, please don't ask it to write your college term paper. We actually can figure it out pretty well, at least still this semester. Probably by next semester, they might get too sophisticated. But it takes about 3 microwave minutes. And then if you ask it to render a 5-second video, next slide, please. It takes about 1 microwave hour. And just to do this silly thing. So you could say, okay, you just mentioned, Gabe, seconds, minutes, even an hour. That seems kind of trivial. Can I have the next slide, please? Not trivial when you think about how many users there are. 2 billion queries a day, and this is only one AI engine. This is ChatGPT. So 2 billion queries daily, and it's going to go up. Each query is taking, 5 microwave seconds, 10 an hour, and that's a lot of energy. Next slide, please. And as Scott's going to expand on, we already have a lot of data centers in operation. That's a map on the left of operation proposed. And there are a lot descending on the state of Indiana, as you know, from a lot of the proposals and community pushback we've been seeing. So there's a lot of data centers that are at least proposed for Indiana. Whether they end up being built here or not is a good question. But we're pretty ripe for that, I think, because of some of the ways that we do our tax laws and so forth. But regardless, it's a reality that we have to take really seriously. And the figure on the right is the first indication to me that, oh, well, clearly someone has thought through how much electricity we'll need, and if we have enough electricity. Clearly, someone has thought through how much water do we need? Do we have enough water in the right places? But in reality, they have not. And so this is the beginning of, I think, a really robust conversation over the next couple of years that will make sure that we right size the resources to the technology. And that's going to be really critical. Can I have a next slide, please? So, are these really consuming that much electricity? Yeah, they really are. This is the past and projected growth. On the right is a bunch of the major energy grids that we have in the U.S. MISO is in there, I think, in the middle tier. Something's blocking my view right now, but you can see that they consume a lot and they're growing. And as a frame of reference, they're at about what are they? They're about 80 gigawatts now. The total grid is only 1,250 gigawatts, so that's a pretty large fraction of the total grid capacity. And this is coming at the same time when Indiana residents even alone have seen their electricity bills raised by about 17.5% over the last year. I'm not saying that's all from data centers. In fact, it's probably not. But nevertheless, you're confronting a state and having a consumer take more of the supply. So of course the price goes up. It should go up. And so this is something that should be in everyone's mind as well. When do we start actually hitting levels that we've seen in other states in terms of percent of our income going toward data centers? That's not like data centers you use. They're not parsing out your searches and applying it to your bill, right? That's everyone's searches. So I think you have to think through that pretty carefully. And now, can I have the next slide, please? Uh, they consume a tremendous amount of water. The data sheet that we have will expand on that significantly and are projected to consume a lot more. I think it's important to know also that this isn't just water that's freely available anywhere and that they benignly use and then add back into some mystical water supply. A lot of this, or some of it at least, is treated water. So there's drinking water. So this is taking away from municipal water supplies. And it's true that water cycle is a water cycle. So every bit of water that's being used in a data center does not disappear. In fact, it will go someplace else, but it will likely not go back to the aquifer, the groundwater system from which that water is drawn, right? It's transferred to the surface water. And it may or may not include some contaminants and excess heat. So the water issue is a big one. Can I have the next slide, please? It also, as you can imagine, it has potential to have a pretty large climate cost. Um, if we lived in a sunny world, and not just sunny in meteorological terms, but in disposition, these things would all be hooked up to solar panels, and all would be good, and we wouldn't care about it a whole lot. But they actually need continuous energy. They're not intermittent technologies because they're 24/7 kind of demand. And so you have to have other backup sources. I mean, certainly that can be battery storage, but for right now, and they're often relying on dirtier energy. In fact, the data center energy is dirtier than the average U.S. grid supply, which is a big concern. Uh, they also have on-site diesel generators as backups, which becomes a huge issue because of local pollution. They also, again, another grid issue that I want to bring up that I failed to bring up earlier is they take up enough electricity such that there's an example in New Jersey where one company owned five AI centers, right, which is pretty normal in a region on one particular grid. The company went through sort of unannounced, at least to the utility provider, shut down for maintenance, standard maintenance of all of their data centers. It shut the grid down and caused a regional blackout because they weren't consuming, they weren't, the hose no longer had anything to give the electricity to. So all that electricity backed up on the grid and blew transformers to the left and right. So um, I, I think that maybe others can speak to this more elegantly, but there has to be a better way that these data centers are communicating with utilities and utility providers on a very active, in an active manner. Have the next slide, please. So I this is why a lot of people, Ben Inskeep from is one of them from uh, from a statewide environmental organization who say we really need to at least put a pause on these or require the facilities themselves uh, to bring power because this is becoming a big issue and we can't just keep kicking it down the road. And next slide, please. So there are ample solutions out there, types of solutions, but they haven't really been pursued yet because there hasn't been a need to, right? The data centers have gone in, they've been consuming water, they've been consuming electricity. The grid so far has been able to kind of barely manage some of that in some places and easily manage it in other states. But I think that we ought to have a serious conversation about the technology itself. One of them is that when you ask that AI to write a stupid joke, it is literally looking through over 1 billion ways that it could write a joke based on how other people have wrote jokes and how words are sequenced together to come up with its stupid joke, right? And so it's way the way that a lot of our AIs have been built are just way too much potential for even the stupid tech joke. I might add that there's a China company that announced earlier this year, that they developed a system that was used about 1,000th of the energy that the common ones do now, because they just simply limited the number of queries. Do you really need 1 billion permutations on a stupid joke? No, you don't actually. So there's ways to control that. But for right now, we're still a bit in the Wild West of some of the ways that these things are built. But we'll get better, I'm sure. The other is that there can be ways that can control their demand of electricity through some kind of slowdowns, like we see commonly with other utilities. They can bring their own electricity generation with them, which would be a very welcome step. And I'm not talking about diesel backups. I'm talking about real sustainable production. Even if it is the intermittent kind like solar, they can feed into a grid and, in a sense, at least make the grid slightly greener than it was before. Another thing they could use, which they don't commonly use, are closed loop water systems. So they recycle the water. The advantage of that is not only are you protecting a resource that is actually pretty limited in a lot of ways, but that resource, you're throwing away heat. Heat is energy. So you're throwing away heat because you need to get rid of that heat somewhere. You can recycle heat through some kind of cogeneration and make it to be a benefit instead of a pollutant. And and finally, there's got to be better regulatory needs. I think there's some conversation at the state level about developing kind of state level policy, because right now what we're seeing is a lot of communities are confronted with these AI centers and they're saying no, which is probably a perfectly fine answer. But they don't actually have the kind of information they need. The AI centers are not coming with data on water resources in the area or electrical resources. There's like no boss overseeing all of this. So there should probably be a state level regulatory body that examines this from a resource perspective as well as a practical perspective. And then could I have my final slide at least? And so in 2025, actually, we have seen some action on this in the Indiana State House. They enacted a bill that actually required data centers to come up with 80% of their cost of increased generation. Um, of course, that says commit. I don't know how legal a term commit is. It might just be promise, and hopefully it'll work out later. But hopefully, this is a step toward a better regulation of the Wild West in terms of data centers. So to sum it up, data centers won't ruin the planet if we do this right. They won't deprive your bank account if we do it right. But the thing is, we do have to do it right. And I think that we're going to see a lot more communication between scientists, resource managers, ethicists, and regulatory agencies to make sure we get it right. So thanks very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Scott.
Thank you. I might chime in just because we're already getting a lot of questions rolling in. And so I think some of them Gabe might be able to address, and then I think some of them are more technology focused, and we can cover those after we hear from Scott. So Gabe, just a couple of questions for you. People were interested in hearing a little bit more about thermal energy pollution. and the temperature or thermal water pollution and the temperature increases of the water that's getting discharged, and also how that might impact ecosystems. I think we think a lot about plopping these data centers down in farmland, but there's other ecosystem forest streams and wetland ecosystems that are also involved in at risk. So I'm curious if you have any other insights into the thermal water pollution issue, and then if you have any other thoughts about other types of ecosystems that might be threatened.
No, it's an excellent question. I mean, the nuclear industry has to deal with this a lot. They produce a lot of hot water also. It can have huge impacts on ecosystems. If you think of a data center, if they are disposing of that hot water on-site wetlands that are constructed, the heat will dissipate and the water will eventually infiltrate into the aquifer. So, in a sense, that can be dealt with. I don't know to what extent it's being dealt with now, unfortunately.
Thank you. All right, Scott, we're excited to hear from you.
I could have listened to Gabe all day. But yes, hopefully I'll cover some useful topics here, and I promise not to go on too long, and we can let the discussion flow from there. So let's see. Okay, does that look okay on your guys' side, or is that the outline view?
We're
Does it
seeing
look
the
okay?
speaker notes. Yeah, we're seeing
Oh, the
the
speaker. Okay,
yep
let me try one more time.
swap monitors for us.
Application window, perhaps. There we go. And
No,
present.
still the speaker notes.
Yep. I think there's a way to click.
Oh, there's a swap displays option.
There we go. Does that look better?
That looks great. Thank
All
you.
right, we'll go with that. Yep. No, terrific job, Gabe, as always. So yeah, I'll try to keep this on the briefer side. I'd like to just maybe piggyback a little bit off of what Gabe was describing there and talk a bit more about some of the underlying technologies, some of the intersections with other emerging fields that are playing out here, and also spend just a couple minutes talking about the regulatory landscape, here in Indiana, as well as nationally, and even a little bit, globally with kind of what we're seeing. But lot to cover. I know never enough time, so I'll try to keep it pretty brief here. Quick, just note of clarification. I am no longer the executive director of the Oyster Workshop, though I had the pleasure of serving in that role for the last 6 years. So Eduardo Brandizio, and just momentarily when she joins, Jess Steinberg have taken over, and that's a wonderful upgrade for the workshop in terms of our senior leadership there. But I still am thankful to be able to run our cybersecurity internet governance program. And for what it's worth, before I took the red pill and got really interested in kind of tech governance topics, I was really interested and taught environmental law. I was in the environmental law clinic back in the day. And I started off at IU actually teaching sustainability topics. So I've always been really kind of keen and focused on that intersection between these fields. And in this case, the environmental impacts of technology, could not be more front of mind for a lot of us. So I'm again grateful for this conversation and the wonderful work that ERI is doing in this space, including with partnership where it makes sense with Ostrom. So in terms of some of the big trends we're seeing, there's different ways to frame these out. But we have been doing some work talking about them in terms of this kind of Super 7 notion. And these are some of the more significant technological developments that are impacting kind of a broad swath of industry, frankly, society, us in academia, and also, are having pretty major environmental implications. That was kicked off in large part, frankly, by crypto mining and blockchain applications. Some years ago now, there was a lot of concern and interest, still is, frankly, about the amount, for example, of Bitcoin mining and how that was, already at that point more than the entire, for example, national grid of Ireland. And we're adding, basically the equivalent of new Manhattans all the time. So the conversation, began with that, but you're absolutely right. As we just heard from Gabe, it's being supercharged because of these developments in AI and the underlying data centers. But just be mindful that these same types of data centers can be used for multiple applications mentioned. Some are, though a lot of the driving force behind these new massive investments has been on the AI side. It's funny when you look at tables comparing countries with things like data centers. The U.S. is always in a bit of a league of its own. Like the most up-to-date list I've seen, notes about 5,400 data centers across the U.S., whereas Germany, for example, had in the hundreds. But one of the big differences is because a lot of those are on the smaller side because they were driven by that earlier crypto mining boom, right? And we're quite targeted for that effort. Whereas what we're talking about here is very different if you're really trying to get the most advanced GPUs and train the largest and most sophisticated large language models. There's other trends to be mindful of as well. The fact that everything's hyper connected, that creates a lot of interesting opportunities, but also a lot of demands and processing power. So this Internet of Things issue also comes up in this context. Metaverse and just kind of augmented reality. There's some interesting applications going on there. Here at IU, we have a lot of folks interested in quantum computing. That's a big push, of course, nationwide. We're involved with this quantum corridor with Purdue and Notre Dame as well. That has some interesting implications for all this because depending on how advances in quantum computing emerge, as well as, frankly, this thing you might not have heard of next, neuromorphic computing, that could potentially have some upside benefits in terms of environmental impacts. Neuromorphic computing, for example, you think about it as basically mirroring how our minds, how our brains are structured, and doing it in such a way that those neural nets are a lot less energy intensive in the way these actual chips are structured than current GPU kind of base technologies. So if we can actually make some of those advances, and there's groups at Luddy and otherwise working on these technologies now, so potentially, down the road, and again, we're talking some years down the road still, that could have some really positive knock-on benefits to the next generation of data centers that could be powering, for example, quantum computers. And there's, a lot of other stuff we could talk about along these lines as well, but I wanted to flag just some of those. As Gabe was saying, there is a heck of a lot of environmental impacts depending on the type of technology as well as exploring the intersections between those. Jess is going to help fill in more of the environmental impacts of AI in just a minute, but I wanted to flag just a couple of others. I mentioned Bitcoin and kind of mining and blockchain applications more broadly. Just note that kind of Web 3.0 boom already was leading to about 1% of global energy consumption, right? And that was, several years ago at this point. So it's already a significant draw, and that's only growing, as you see there with the impact of AI. If for those who are interested in these kind of topics more broadly, and again, Jess can speak to this based on her work with conflict minerals and otherwise, but the Daily from the New York Times had a great podcast yesterday where they were talking about recycling batteries around the world and the huge environmental costs that that's causing, including lead poisoning, right? So again, benefits as well as big drawbacks in terms of how that is actually implemented and where the regulatory rubber meets the road, right? There's also from a cybersecurity perspective, and I promise I'm not going to talk much about cybersecurity. It's easy to get on a bit of a high horse with that stuff, but there's an interesting balancing act with this right to repair idea. So different jurisdictions like the EU are leaning in heavily to this right to repair notion, which is fantastic, right? So the idea is repair it, don't replace it, better for the environment, makes perfect sense. From a security perspective, always the balancing act has been usually the longer a product is out, the more backdoors are found and the more ways in which folks can be compromised. And of course, companies, ultimately countries could pay the cost for that as well. So there's always an interesting, aspect to all this. And we talk about that a lot, for example, in some of my courses when you have to balance these national security and related environmental costs to some of these technologies. So again, Jess is going to go into more detail. Gabe has already laid a fantastic foundation for us, but there's a lot of these environmental impacts that deserve, frankly, a lot more work. There was a proposed center not too long ago, for example, that would have used more energy than the entire city of Indianapolis here in Indiana. Of course, wetlands is already an issue across the state and across the Midwest and beyond. That has a big impact. Water consumption is of course huge here as well. And along like what I just mentioned in terms of the battery reuse. This is another, I thought, useful chart to give you a sense of those 5,400 plus, data centers, how they're tied in. Again, depending on the moment, there's but either on the order of dozens to many hundreds more data centers being planned and at various stages of the approval process, as we've been seeing, and as I'll highlight more in just a moment, it can be a fraught approval process. There's a lot of steps along the way, and some, jurisdictions have been more permissive than others. We see that mirrored globally, by the way. But as you can see here, I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of demand for those existing centers, and as Gabe was alluding to, that's already causing increased energy costs. So how are we responding? There's interesting, layers to all of this. On the one hand, there are tech firms that at least pay lip service. It could be greenwashing, depending on the firm and depending on how it's couched, to the importance of having either a net neutral, carbon neutral, or even an actual positive impact in terms of their data center energy use and broader environmental impacts. We see the likes of Microsoft restarting 3 Mile Island, for example. There's a lot of interest in nuclear, right? There's a lot of interest in finding other alternative sources. I even read an article recently about Google wanting to pilot data centers in space, right? And actually beam the equivalent of that data and that energy back and forth. So it's a really interesting time and that just gives you a sense, by the way, of just the scale of investment, right? I mean, again, you see wide varieties there, but it's on the order of many Manhattan and or Apollo projects all happening at the same time. And to make that degree of scale, that degree of investment pay off is going to be a quite a feat. But for those companies that are first movers in this space, they perceive such an advantage that they're willing to pay that premium just to be, a member of that first mover club, as it were. So the social responsibility there is an interesting one to tug on. We're doing some work right now looking at OpenAI. They've recently reincorporated as a benefit corporation. If you're familiar with the way that organization is structured, it's this nonprofit core with this obviously very successful and profitable for-profit entity attached to it. So at least in the US, at least at the federal level, a lot of this is pivoting in the direction of what states are doing. Gabe was mentioning some of Indiana's initiatives and also what some of these companies are trying to do. So we're trying to focus a bit more on what some of those models look like, whereas some failures and some successes. So happy to chat a bit more about that. There's also efforts to empower consumers. So the FCC has put out these trust marks. Initially, the idea was, hey, we're familiar with organic, fair trade labels on products, even Energy Star labels when we're buying new appliances. Could we do something like that that communicates the environmental impact of, for example, a large language model, right? The way we were just hearing about a moment ago, if you ask it to write your term paper. Could you also do that for other smart products, right? So if you're buying a new smart TV after Black Friday or something like that, could you have something like that that communicates the privacy, security features along with the environmental impact? And that's what we're seeing with these FCC trust marks. They're starting to get rolled out, but nothing is a panacea, as Len Ostrom famously said. But they're all pieces to the puzzle, and this can be another one to help empower consumers. So in terms of relevant federal laws, again, I don't have time to go through the laundry list, but I'm happy to take questions along these lines during discussion, or if folks are curious. There are certainly governance gaps in these existing federal laws, keeping in mind that a lot of them now are decades old and haven't been, frankly, updated too frequently since then, right? We do have other rules that are playing an important role here, but still, all of these have important pieces, are important pieces to the puzzle as we think about maturing a more active regulatory landscape that might not be fully embracing of the precautionary principle along these lines we're seeing in the EU right now, but can hopefully help fill in at least a few of these gaps. And at the state level, and as we've seen with some of the approval of these data centers that I know Jess is going to be talking to us more about, and welcome, Jess, as well. There's a lot of different levels here, a lot of different approvals and forums that need to be run through all the way from, county council and commissioner meetings, on up through the process of utility interconnections, state boards, etc. So I don't think folks should get the sense that there's a rubber stamp. We've seen a lot of pushback because of, frankly, the environmental costs as well as the long-term employment picture, perhaps not being as rosy as some of these firms initially had tried to sell. And, folks are paying attention to that. But lastly, because I don't want to be all doom and gloom, I just wanted to mention that there is some interesting work being done to try to tie some of these ideas together with the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Particularly through the UN. So I'm going to speed through this and just recognize this one for a minute. So we've been working for a little bit now to try to think about the technological underpinnings of actually realizing the different sustainable development goals. And as some of these technologies have come about, originally this was obviously more cybersecurity focused, but as these technologies have come about, including AI, it's really put a focal point on this specific topic, including, hey, not only do we need to secure water infrastructure from cyber attacks to make sure that folks worldwide have access to clean water, but also if all of that is being used in terms of that water for data centers, boy, that's going to put us in a really challenging position to also meet these sustainable development goals. So I think by kind of approaching it from these overarching topics, sustainability, peace, et cetera, it can drive a lot more people to the conversation for those norm building efforts that can be useful in moving the ball forward, even and help maybe avoid some of the zero sum game discussions that can come up in the race that we've seen play out between some of the major AI powers right now. So I tried to keep that as short and sweet as I could. Teresa, Gabe, sorry, but I'm happy to take a question or just move right on to Jess, whatever you guys prefer.
Thank you. I will say you did talk a little bit about this, but there are questions about how the advances, this technology is advancing very quickly. There are some questions about technologies that are on the horizon or soon to become more broadly available and how that might change the environmental impact. So, for example, AI chips that are much faster, or the possibility of having local computers doing more of this computing rather than it happening at centralized data centers. And so I guess I'm just curious whether folks in your field of study are trying to keep up with these new technologies and how that changes the environmental impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned, just a couple of them. The neuromorphic computing, in my mind, is one of the most exciting because that really would be a dramatic reduction in energy use. That obviously doesn't do a lot for water, but it does make it a little bit less energy intensive and water intensive because, frankly, the things just don't get so hot, so they don't need as much water to cool them down. But the main savings there are definitely going to be on the energy side. There are other advances that are being, discussed. As you would imagine, a ton of investments going into doing whatever we can to lower the costs because they are dramatic. So that's one that is getting a lot of attention. If you could get either computing done on-prem as it's called, or basically within a given ecosystem and not relying on cloud infrastructure, that also helps. The way to do that at the scale we're talking about here would be to have more functional quantum computing applications, maybe powered by obviously renewable sources, maybe modular nuclear sources as well, right? And there's definitely a lot of interest and investment, including right up in Indianapolis, going into that kind of a structure too. Again, these are kind of that bleeding edge tech, but if you look to see kind of where we're headed, it's not out of the realm of possibility that by 2030 we could see, quantum computing, fed by more of these modular reactors and or more of that infrastructure existing even in space. And again, that's only made possible by the sheer amount of investment that's happening right now, which is really eye-watering.
Wow. Thank you. Jess, thank you for joining us. I think we're excited to dig a little bit more deeply into some of the more upstream impacts of data centers, and we're excited to hear your presentation. I think we've got your slides. Are we bringing them up?
Sure, or I can also share. I've got them as well.
Alexandra, do you have them?
I have them, but if she'd like to share, that's also fine.
I'll just share. It's pretty easy.
Perfect.
Thanks,
okay.
Jess.
Let me just get the, all right, let me, okay. Thanks very much. Can you guys see the sort of general AI?
We're seeing your speaker notes. I think you have to swap
I don't actually
displays.
have, yeah, I'm not sure why that's doing that. Hold on one second, because I didn't actually,
You could just go to
Uncheck the
display
little-
settings above.
I had the same problem, Jess. Yeah, if you bring it back up and just click the display settings, it'll give you a prompt and you just click accept.
where does the display settings point come up? So share. Yeah, I'm not sure it's working super well here.
Do you
We
need
can
the
also
speaker
use
notes?
mine.
Yeah, let's just use, because I'm not really sure. Unless can you see it right now?
I was gonna try to what? Oh,
It says it's sharing, but I'm not sure what's happening right now. So,
We're
we
looking
can.
at your eyes. We're sharing it from your
okay,
eye,
great. Let's
Jess.
just do that. That sounds good.
Yep, we're
Okay.
good to roll.
Thanks, you guys, and I'm sorry I'm late. I really apologize. I know a little bit about what Scott was covering, so I think I'm going to emphasize a few things and build on them a little bit. And if you could move to the next slide, that'd be great. I'm really just going to provide an overview of sort of right what we're talking about here. I'm sure that Scott covered a little bit about these data centers, which is really the backbone, the sort of infrastructure and backbone of artificial intelligence, where all the computing is happening, and it's really where the storage for the servers, networking equipment, power, and cooling is actually happening. Now, again, Scott may have mentioned this, but we're really looking primarily at the hyperscale data centers. That's where much of the AI computing is happening. We're talking about more than 5,000 servers and sort of really, really large campuses, right? These have very large environmental footprints, right? In the US, we're talking about approximately 600 hyperscale campuses where much of the AI computing is occurring, much of the sort of large language model data training is occurring. The US leads the world in the number of data centers and the number of hyperscale centers as well. There are over 4,000 data centers in the US, is led by Virginia, has the most by far, and then Texas and then California, and they're largely owned, I'm sure Scott went over this, by the large three, the sort of big three tech firms, right? Indiana ranks relatively highly in terms of the number of data centers that it has. Certainly has been in the news a lot, as I'm sure you're aware, of sort of some of these very large hyperscale campuses that are being developed here, right? So this is just this actual picture of one of Amazon's hyperscale data center in New Carlisle, Indiana. So you can just tell the sheer scale of it. If you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. I'm just gonna sort of go through a little bit the main areas of significant environmental impacts and resource use. Primarily, right, I've sort of ranked these in what I think are sort of the most sort of the highest priority in terms of largest consumption. So power and the resulting sort of greenhouse gas results, water consumption, contamination, mineral use, and then land. So if you want to go to the next one, we'll start a little bit with the sort of power. And one thing to remember, many of you probably heard this statistic, right? But that a ChatGPT request uses 10 times the energy of a straight Google search, right? So you can imagine that as AI has been integrated into all of these platforms, the energy usage has increased exponentially, right? And one hyperscale center is sort of equal to the amount of energy and power consumption of about 100,000 households. So this is pretty significant. And we think about where the source is coming from for this power. This is really primarily natural gas. This has been the largest driver. There have been more and more renewables, but as Scott mentioned, nuclear is really where all of the investment and interest is right now in terms of trying to meet the impressively and exponentially increasing power demands that are resulting from all of the capital investment in data center and data center construction. Coal still makes up about 15% of power supply for data centers. And because of the mix of natural gas and coal, the actual carbon intensity of data centers is about 45% higher than the average sort of sector in the US. So that means it produces significantly more greenhouse gases per unit of electricity consumed than the average sector, right? And if you can see, this is a graph that's been sort of making the rounds that the Berkeley laboratory generated in terms of predictions of how much electricity we expect data centers to consume moving forward. So they've been about 1.9% of the US total energy consumption, and they're expected to increase potentially up to 12% by 2028 or 2030. So that's pretty significant. You go to the next page, that'd be great, or next slide, that'd be great. right? And this has really important consequences globally, but if we think like actually the significant and immediate consequences are quite local. There's a significant strain on local and regional grid systems. Not just in order to maintain the load, but they're needing to build new infrastructure, new substations, upgrade existing infrastructure. In Indiana alone, the demand for power is expected to double by 2035 just due to investment in data centers. So this is pretty significant. It requires significant upgrading of electrical infrastructure across the state. If we think about, in terms of what this means for greenhouse gas emissions, we're expecting this to amount to about 105 million tons of CO2, it was 105 million tons of CO2 in 2023, right? Which was about 2.8% of US emissions and about 2% of the global emissions, right? So this is a really power hungry sector with significant consequences, both for our distribution of energy sources, but also and as a result for greenhouse gas emissions more broadly. You can go on to the next slide, that'd be great. The next area that is of sort of significant, frankly, concern is with water use. Much of the way in which water is used in the data centers is for evaporative cooling, passing the water through a medium that then cools the system. These are pretty impressive amounts of water, especially in the regions where these data centers are located. So we're talking about up to 5 million gallons a day, which is about the same amount of a town of up to 50,000 people. And we're really expecting that by 2028, particularly the hyperscale data centers, the ones where most of where the AI computing is occurring, is likely to get to over 100 billion liters, which is just an incredible increase. Microsoft alone reported using about 1.5 billion gallons of water in 2022, which is a 34% increase over the year before. That is incredible for one company. And there are some estimates, there's some unpublished reports that have come out that have really suggested we're looking at a national water consumption increase of 170%. So how do we think about managing our water resources to meet that sort of rapidly growing demand? Now, it's also important that's really just the direct usage. Now, if we think about our last slide on power consumption, right? Much of electricity generation also uses a significant amount of water. And so when we think about the increases of power and electricity consumed by data centers, we're also increasing the amount of water consumed, even beyond just the evaporative cooling, in the indirect area of power generation electricity. And then finally, beyond water consumption, we also sort of have the challenge of water contamination in local regions where data centers are located. Right, so you see the runoff from cooling within the data centers can essentially leach into water systems, right? Leaving contamination and chemical discharge in those water systems. Proximity to wetlands can really require the diversion of streams and significant harm to those ecosystems, right? As well as creating and diverting stormwater runoff in these massive sort of concrete campuses, right? So there's both the water usage challenge, which we see sort of in this graph in the bottom right, sort of increasing significantly, particularly through hyperscale data centers, but also the consequences of contamination for local communities. And one of the challenges is that, if you look in the upper right picture here, right, this is a data center built in Mesa, Arizona, one of the most drought-stricken regions of the country, right, consuming 1 million gallons of water a day. So there's sort of really significant, we can think about the really significant regional consequences and sort of importance of consideration of local context for understanding the effects and the environmental effects of AI. We can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so the third area is that of the minerals. And this is an area that I've done a little bit of work on myself directly, right? Which is that there's a wide range of both critical and non-critical, and as well as rare earth minerals used, particularly in the development of the servers themselves, as well as the networking equipment. One of the important things to note is that the vast majority of the minerals that are required, particularly for the data centers themselves, right? The servers, the networking equipment, all of that are imported. And this is important because we have limited transparency or understanding or capacity to regulate the context in which these minerals are extracted. I've done a fair amount of work to demonstrate the sort of wide variation in both environmental regulation as well as labor rights at extractive sites for things like copper, tin, tantalum, the major resources that are required for these centers. This is compounded by the fact that we've seen a wide range of tariffs implemented on some of the major minerals required, particularly on copper, which is one of the highest demand for these data centers, both in terms of the actual servers, but also in terms of networking equipment and transmission. Similarly on aluminum and steel. And so this is really sort of, hampered the capacity to develop develop these AI data centers while at the same time we're facing in the places that we can import from potential challenges at extractive sites. It's important to note that the sort of vast increase in investment in AI data centers is expected to represent up to 3% of global demand for things like copper. That is huge, particularly because at the same time, right, there's a massive push for these same minerals to be used in technologies for a green transition, right? So these multiple processes happening at the same time, putting extreme pressure on demand for these resources, particularly copper, steel, and a few others. Right? It's also important to note all of these components build on each other, right? So the demand for power means new substations, new electricity, new transmission lines, which requires additional demand for these resources. And I put together a table on the next slide, if you can go to that one, that just gives a bit of an overview of the main resources that are required, particularly, this is just primarily the direct use of these resources in, these mineral resources in building the data center, particularly the servers, right? So silver is really important, copper, and what we see here is sort of these are the main ones required in server construction. And note that some of these are required for semiconductors and microchips, many of which we import. So we don't, directly necessarily import some of these minerals for although we do develop some of those ourselves, but the majority of them we are importing. But it's important to note that only gold and boron do we supply domestically. Everything else, we import a significant portion of it, some of it like tantalum, 100% of it. And some of these sort of more critical minerals, right? Fluorspar, gallium, germanium. And you can see the countries that we're importing them from. Many of them subject to tariffs. And so, we really rely on supply chains and good trade relationships in order to be able to access these minerals for data centers. Next slide. And so just to keep in mind, I've sort of gathered two other sort of areas we might focus our concerns on are the sort of land needs, right? If we think about the hyperscale data centers, this is up to hundreds of thousands, up to 1 million square feet for a single campus, right? 15.5 football fields for a single hyperscale data center, right? The one that was planned for Hancock County in Indiana that's been on hold was about 775 acres. That is a large portion of land. And the location really matters for what we think of as the potential, right, environmental consequences, whether it's wetlands or farmlands, right? So it's really, really important to think about, one thing we talk a lot about at the Ostrom workshop, right, is the local context, the local information that communities might have that can help understand what the most detrimental environmental consequences are likely to be in a given location. There's also this concern about e-waste, disposals of servers and storages and sort of the storage and networking equipment, right? These are replaced about every 6 to 10 years, but the challenges, right, have to do with the fact that technology is evolving so quickly that they are being replaced before the end of their lifespan. And what do we do with those servers? The only data out there on sort of recycling a lot of this e-waste is rather limited and suggests that not many of these companies or data centers have good plans for how to manage this e-waste that can have pretty significant heavy metals. Now, if you can go to the next slide, I know Scott talked a lot about some of the legislation. I think when we think about ways forward of really managing and thinking seriously about these environmental consequences and the resource demands that particularly data centers are placing. I think making headway on reporting and transparency requirements around resource use, water use, power consumption. There have been some states that have put bills forth to sort of think about that. The potential, again, I think Scott may have mentioned this, global certification schemes. When we can get those right, they can be effective, particularly when you have sort of focal focus points like the SDGs. Um, and then there are at the state level legislation that is being considered. I will want to bring particular attention to Virginia's state bill that if it passes, actually requires additional local approval for the building of a data center. This is right in line with kind of like an Ostrom approach to thinking about what should matter when considering the sort of environmental consequences, right, of these data centers, right? You would want to get information and buy-in and consultation and discussion with the communities most affected, right? Um, and I think, the rest is sort of stuff I've touched on already. Like there are innovations in cooling. Scott has mentioned innovations in computation and quantum, right? That will hopefully bring down some of these resource demands. Um, and as well as sort of, being really effective and thorough with our environmental impact assessments, which are maybe potentially less likely in light of new federal incentives to sort of advance quickly the permitting process for these data centers. And the rest is very similar to many other challenges we face with tech, right? Supply chain reliance and transparency. How do we maybe document and make sure that we are, uh, satisfied with where many of these resources are coming from, and to acknowledge that in order to keep advancing AI and its potential, which interesting could have feedback effects that could benefit the environment, right? We will need to think pretty seriously about new power generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure, and potentially behind the meter energy as these data centers are sort of really taking up a larger and larger power footprint. So I'll leave it at that. I know I think I went on a little longer than I intended. We're just a couple of minutes left, but thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Jess. We had so many questions. Really appreciate it. And we're definitely not going to be able to answer very many today. But some of the key themes that I'm noticing in the questions are really a desire for more data and study to understand the claims that are being made around data center impacts. Everything from the thermal load and the wastewater to the efficiencies of closed loop cooling or water systems. People are interested in understanding what's motivating some companies to build better, more efficient data centers or provide more community benefits, and whether that's maybe intrinsically motivated by maybe ESG commitments or shareholder demands, or whether it really is down to regulation. And people are very interested in understanding what local actions or local level policy and decision making is relevant. Because I did notice one of the questions that I did have was whether any states were leading with proactive regulation, and I noticed a similarity in the states you mentioned, Jessica, similarities that here in Indiana we do not share. So I think people are really curious on the local level. So that's not a question, but just to say, I would love for each of you researchers to take a look at the questions that were asked and see how that might inform your research, because there are a lot of information gaps that people have when they're trying to understand how they can be influential in these decision-making processes. Thank you so much, everyone.